Wszystko zaczęło się od króla Jagiełły. Mała Łodzia stała się miastem, które w XIX wieku rozwijało się najszybciej na świecie. W ciągu zaledwie 60 lat od powstania pierwszej manufaktury powstaje przemysłowa, wielonarodowościowa metropolia. Jednak wiatry historii nie zawsze jej sprzyjały. To, co zniszczył los, odbudowują łodzianie. Nasza Łódź. Miasto wielkich szans. Od 600 lat w sercu Polski i Europy.
Jesteśmy Polakami. Jesteśmy niezwykłym społeczeństwem. Zawsze w obliczu wielkiego wyzwania potrafimy się mobilizować. Potrafimy stawić czoła wielkim wyzwaniom. Bo nie potrafimy stać obojętnie. Bo obchodzi nas bezpieczeństwo i przyszłość naszych dzieci. Bo wierzymy, że nadzieja zwycięża apatię, lęk i strach. Bo mimo wszelkich przeciwności nigdy się nie poddajemy. Potrafimy ciężko pracować, wspierać się i działać razem. Bo zależy nam na naszej ojczyźnie, naszym osiedlu, naszej ulicy. Bo chcemy naszych niezbywalnych praw i wolności. Bo nie oddamy naszych marzeń. Nadchodzi punkt zwrotny.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alicja Bachulska, and I'm a policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And I'm delighted to welcome you and our great speakers in our panel on EU-China relations. We're going to discuss a pressing issue, but an issue which remains on the margins of the Polish debate. And that's the question of China's rise and the urgency of certain challenges posed by growing and increasingly more assertive China. And to discuss this topic, we have here with us three great speakers. Finbarr Bermingham, he's the Europe correspondent of the South China Morning Post, one of Hong Kong's oldest and most renowned newspapers. He's based in Brussels, but he's covering EU-China relations and many other interesting topics. We have Mareike Ohlberg. She's a senior fellow in the Indo-Pacific Program of the German Marshall Fund, based in Berlin. And she's also the co-author of a very interesting and I would say quite, I wouldn't say scandalous, but a great book that I advise you to read called Hidden Hand, Exposing the Chinese Communist Party, How the Chinese Communist Party is Reshaping the World. I do recommend you have a look at this book. And last but not least, we have Justyna Szczudlik. She's the Deputy Head of Research and Head of Asia-Pacific Program and the China Analyst at the Polish Institute of International Affairs. She's based in Warsaw and she's one of the most insightful experts on EU-China relations, but also China and Central Eastern European countries' relations. So please welcome our speakers. I will start with Finbarr, with a little bit of a provocative question. Is there such a thing as a European China policy? We oftentimes talk about, European approach towards China, European strategy towards China. But in the end, I think that people who don't really follow this discussion very closely might be a little bit confused. What are we actually talking about when we talk about European China policy? Is there such a thing? And what actors, what kind of themes we're discussing these days?
Yeah, it's a good question. And depending on who you ask, there are either too many China policies or basically there are no China policies. Sometimes it feels like every department in every government in Europe has its own China policy. And sometimes it feels like there's not really a coherent policy at all. And the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. There's a lot of slogans, and living and working and reporting in Brussels, it seems to be a city of sort of, platforming and slogans and so on. And I think where we are now is that there's a sort of broad set of parameters that are incredibly vague, that are sort of set in Brussels that the EU 27 are supposed to adhere to. And the problem with that, the fact that they are so broad and so vague, means that each of the member state governments can essentially superimpose and write whatever policy they want, and it will fit within those contours. We're still working with the 2019 designation of China as a competitor, a partner, and a rival at the same time. And I guess that the working theory is that as long as it sort of falls somewhere within those three categories, you can kind of do what you want. I think in recognition of what sort of is a changing global geopolitical environment and a changing China, there have been pretty strong efforts from the Commission in Brussels to change that over the last 6 months, to at least put some meat on the bones and provide some sort of narrow those parameters with which the member states are working. And that's in a very nascent stage, but I guess not many of the member states are terribly enthusiastic about doing it. I mean, the reason why we're still working with the 2019 designation of partner, rival, competitor is that if they crack that open for debate, nobody will be able to agree on a new way of describing it. So you've seen sort of von der Leyen, the Commission President, and her chef de cabinet take a very hands-on role in this sort of effort to flesh it out a little bit. This is the sort of another vague term that's become a massive buzzword in Brussels. This is the de-risking agenda, which we're dealing with now, and that seems to be the direction of travel in terms of what the EU's China policy will be for the sort of the coming period. And von der Leyen laid that out in March in Brussels in her speech. It was a really sort of moment. It felt like, at least for those of us occupying this incredibly niche bubble of China policy in Brussels, it felt like a bit of a landmark moment, because it's so rare to have a political leader get up and sort of lay out their plan and their view of China, because people ordinarily have been afraid to put that in public. It's been a very sort of very touchy subject, a topic from which many politicians are sort of afraid to get too involved in. But to her credit, she got up and she sort of laid out the contours of where she thinks this should be going. This is about reducing our dependencies. This is about diversifying our trading partners, not being exposed. I mean, the pandemic, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, China's coercion of Lithuania, what we've seen in terms of China's economic practices with this week. It's been in the news about the sort of, the subsidizing of electric vehicles, the dumping of solar panels, once again, is back on the agenda. These things are giving this debate some impetus. One EU official who spent maybe too much time in China told me recently that the member states are reluctant on all of this stuff, but China can be Europe's, or von der Leyen at least, von der Leyen's ally in this, because they have a way of opening your eyes with very sharp chopsticks. That was her words. So I think that a lot of European governments would be quite happy to keep these very vague contours of a China policy, but I think what we're beginning to see is that it's narrowing over time, thanks to perhaps the behavior of China, thanks to the changing geopolitical circumstances, the tacit support that China has given Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That's one area in which we definitely see a change in approach from Europe towards China. That sort of transcends everything else and percolates through the entire debate. The problem is, I suppose, de-risking is almost as vague as that triptych of partner, rival, competitor. You know, de-risking in Germany is very different to de-risking in Lithuania. It seems that in Berlin, Mareike probably will know more about this than I do, but it seems as though de-risking, at least in the Chancellery anyway, keep doing what you're doing with China, but do more with other countries and other partners, whereas in Lithuania maybe it means decoupling. And in Hungary, I was in Stockholm at the Indo-Pacific Forum earlier in the year, and de-risking, the Hungarian foreign minister signed up for de-risking and then got on a flight to Beijing and signed a bunch of deals with Huawei. So it means something different to every government, and I guess we're going to work through that over the coming year, or, well, let's see what happens with European elections next year. But, you know, that's, I guess, where we are with EU-China policy.
Thanks, Finbarr. Mareike, Finbarr mentioned Germany, and I think, you know, especially sitting here in Poland, Polish-German relations are not the easiest ones, but I think that we tend to overlook the role Germany has in shaping the European debate on China. And my question is, how do you assess the role of Germany these days in shaping this relationship? Do you think that are you actually more on this kind of chancellery part of debate where you think that Germany will follow will not maybe return to business as usual, to what we've known from Merkel's years in power, but are we actually going to see a true strategic rethink with you know, the new German strategy, or is it just more about kind of stating that change is needed but not really doing much to achieve it?
Thank you very much for this question. Can you hear me? Okay, great. So yes, as a German in Poland, explaining German-China policy towards a Polish audience, I think is a little bit of a challenge for me, because I mean, some of you will be familiar with the German position on, you know, what the problems at the EU are with China policy. The German position is always, well, we're actually quite ahead, but then there's China coming to divide the EU by establishing mechanisms such as 16, then 17, now 14+1, so just pairing up with various Central and Eastern European countries on a one-on-one basis. But as I've been saying for a long time, and since before it was cool, I mean, Germany and France have a substantially bigger impact on the whole on European China policy. And oftentimes, Germany and France have been, of course, holding European China policy back, whether that is by holding countries back that are ahead of Germany and France, or, and this is the other important point, by basically giving an excuse to other countries that don't want to act, that can then say, oh, Germany is not doing anything substantial on China. Why should we risk doing anything substantial on China? I think this is a fairly big sentiment in parts of Southern Europe, but also in other parts of Europe, right? So we come from this point of view. Now, what we currently have is, of course, a debate in Germany on China that has been changing. And it's not a change that has happened overnight. There's been build up to that. I think the first time that people were in Germany were like, oh, maybe we can't do business as usual with China was in 2016, when a Chinese company bought an advanced German robotics company, and then there was a little concern about that. Under the Trump administration, there was the sense that, oh, we're going to be made to choose between China and the US. I don't like this framing of being forced to choose, because I don't think Germany is in the middle. I think we're very clearly on one side. But then with a pandemic and seeing a more aggressive face of China, and especially since the Russian invasion of Ukraine and China's position on that, things have really changed. Now, is this going to be an actual change that's going to last, and is it going to have an impact on the EU debate? I'm really not sure, because, and you will know this, but just to explain for everybody, there is a difference in positions in Germany right now. You do have a lot of ministries, I think, inside the current German government that are very, very clear about the challenges that China poses for Germany and for Europe, and they have been taking certain measures that are within their area of expertise, what they can do, their competencies, right? For instance, they might say, oh, we're not going to give you investment insurance for your investment in China because you're taking a risk here. So there are those smaller measures that are happening at the ministerial level, but then there is also debate driven by a part of industry that is we can't afford to not have good relations with China, which is a position that is exemplified by the Chancellery. And ultimately, the problem that there is no unity on these topics is going to be a problem in terms of the steps that Germany can take. One thing I want to point towards here to close up my input is the China strategy that was recently released by the German government, and this both exemplifies the potential that we have, but also some of the problems we have. So this is a China strategy that the German government had been wanting to publish for months. It kept getting delayed, in part, I think, because the German Chancellery maybe wanted to have its consultations with the Chinese government first before releasing this kind of document. It was then rolled out in July in a way that signaled that it was mainly by the German Foreign Office. So the Chancellor wasn't there, the other ministries weren't there. Our foreign minister basically rolled it out herself. Nonetheless, I think there are a lot of good things in the China strategy that got rolled out. It was watered down from previous versions which leaked, but ultimately it gave a very realistic, very harsh, you could say, descriptions of the changes that China has undergone. And those things are now out there. And you can't really roll them back. You have put them out there, and you have basically given this as a blueprint to act. It's going to be difficult to come up with the right measures as long as there is no unity. However, and this is where I come back to Europe, I do think there's a good thing in the China strategy, even if Germany doesn't get its act together perfectly on this. It gives other countries something to act. Other countries can now look at this China strategy and say, okay, we can no longer say that Germany is doing nothing. They've put out this document with very, very clear language. So other countries that also want to use this can actually use it to come up with their own measures, with their own policy in the absence of a unified EU policy. And this is why I'm actually quite happy about this document and think on the whole it is a good thing.
Thanks, Mareike. This is a very nuanced assessment, and I do agree that it's not a perfect strategy, but definitely it's a guiding post for other countries to potentially emulate, or at least start a debate. Turning to you, Justyna, Mareike also mentioned the infamous 16, 17, 14 plus 1, any number plus 1 platform for cooperation that for many years was seen in Europe, especially in Western European countries, as this quote-unquote Trojan horse of the European unity. But now, since both the pandemic and the war in Ukraine, it seems that this region, Central and Eastern Europe, is more at the forefront of a much more assertive debate and approach towards China. Do you think that the war in Ukraine was actually the turning point, or were there any other factors at play?
So do you hear me? Oh, wonderful. Good afternoon. Well, to be honest, I would like to answer your question, but afterwards, if you don't mind, just to refer to Finbarr's and Mareike inputs. Well, when it comes to your question, if there's a turning point, so yes and no. Maybe I say with yes, because the Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the fact that China endorses Russia was like a additional alarm bell when it comes to the Central Eastern European perception of China. So in that sense, it was to some extent a turning point. I said yes and no. And no, why no? Because the fact that that a few years ago we started to rethink as a region, we started to rethink our perception and our approach towards China. And the reason for that, there are many reasons, because, well, maybe I start very, very shortly to explain why we decided to reinvigorate our relations with China, why we decided to be the participants of the so-called famous 16, 17, 16, now 14 plus 1 formula. There were 3 main reasons: political, economic, and security related. Political, because China is right at that time, in 2000, the format was established 2012 in April in Warsaw. At that time, we perceived China as a rising power, a global power. So for us, it was very important to have a pretty close political cooperation with a global power in order to also enhance our international standing. So it was important. So not having close relations, intensive relations with China means that we'll be marginalized. So it is the first reason. The second one, economic. Of course, huge market, perception of China as an opportunity, rising middle class in China. So this kind of our perception that we could also have Chinese investment, high level, greenfield, not M&A and not loans, credit related investment. And the second one, it was also kind of a channel, having channels with China to explain to China why we are afraid of, we are concerned of closer China-Russia relations, because for us it was obvious that China is our huge challenge and a threat. Russia is our huge challenge and a threat. And after years of enhancing this cooperation within this framework and also bilaterally, we started to see that there is no any tangible benefit, tangible results, positive results for us. Politically, China has become, under Xi Jinping, it's obvious, more authoritarian. It's not an asset to have close relations. It's not an asset when it comes to improving our international standing. Economically, trade deficit expanding, no specific Chinese investment, mostly the same mode like in Africa and this whole global south, loans, credits, no greenfield, no high level investments, and security related issues. So I think that I say the kind of a turning point we could be 2017 when China and Russia jointly conducted naval drills in the Baltic Sea. So something completely new. So it was the reason why we started to think and started to rethink our perception of China. And of course, in the last 2-3 years, 2 red lines I think that China already crossed. The first one was coercion against Lithuania. It was completely new kind of a coercion. It was not like a coercion against Japan, even not like a coercion against Australia, that China stopped to import some products and some from those countries, but it was process of weaponization, supply chains. So we realized that even having very shallow economic relations, we could be exposed to Chinese coercion via, let's say, other countries, Germany, even United States, if China would like to exert pressure on those countries. And of course, the last point is Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the fact that China supports Russia in a very open way. I would like to say it openly, politically / diplomatically, but also economically and even in a security domain, providing Russia with some dual-use devices. And if I may just follow up to the first question, if the EU has, to some extent, a cohesive policy towards China, I think that there's some differences between me and Finbarr is that Finbarr see the glass full empty. I see the glass half empty. I see the glass half full. Because to be honest, when you look at the change of US approach towards China in the last few years, it is a tremendous change in a very short period, in several years. And of course, it's difficult to have a cohesive policy towards China, having 27 member states with different perception of China. But I think it's a huge progress. Even this threefold approach as partner, competitor, and rival, there is also a change that this pillar, which is called rival, is bigger and higher than this let's say pillar of perceiving China as a partner and competitor. And as a follow-up to what Mareike said about German-China strategy, I would say that it is very good strategy when it comes to the definition and the diagnosis what China is and what China is doing. It is a very comprehensive, detailed list of China's actions which are detrimental for us. And to be honest, I have some of thinking that if I meet someone who knows nothing about China, what China is doing bad, so I should give to him or her the strategy, China's German strategy, to read it. To be honest, it is very strong political signal, and even the narrative, because Germany matters, and this language and narrative matters. Of course, there's a question about implementation, I know, but at this narrative level, it is a very strong signal, especially that it is from Germany. So I stop here. Thank you.
Go read it.
Thanks, Justyna. Going back to Finbarr, let's switch the perspective. You were based in Hong Kong for quite a while, and you do have quite a lot of insights also when it comes to the Chinese part of this story. So do you think that Europe is actually taken seriously in Beijing? And how does actually China react to all these narrative and policy changes taking place in Europe these days?
Yeah, it depends what you classify as Europe, I guess. I've got a couple of anecdotes on this front that I heard from over the last couple of years that help explain it. I had a chance to speak to Nicolas Chapuis, who was the European Union's ambassador to China. Now, this guy's a sinologist. He plans to spend his retirement translating Chinese poetry. He went to Beijing as a very sort of like positive impression of the Chinese government. First time he had a meeting with the foreign ministry, with the lesser spotted Qin Gang, who has since dropped off the radar totally. He was told, "Ambassador, why are you here? You have no purpose here. If we need something, we will pick up the phone to Berlin or to Paris." And that was for him a really harsh lesson. You know, he dedicated his life to learning about China, and he was told he's irrelevant. And I guess that illustrates, you know, quite well how China sees Europe. You know, it doesn't have any great time for the European Union. It picks up the phone to France and Germany, and this is quite a successful tactic, I guess, because it allows, you know, China to, in the terminology of others, divide and conquer. Second anecdote I'll share was when I had a chance to interview the Chinese ambassador in Brussels to the European Union, Fu Tong, when he first arrived at the end of last year. And about half an hour into the interview, I said to him, "Ambassador, I haven't asked you a single question about the United States, but every answer you give me goes back to America." And what I sort of deduced from that is that everywhere there is a problem in the European relationship with China, the Chinese see the black hand of the United States. So I guess there's layers to this. There's a sense that the European Union as a sort of body is not taken that seriously, because the Chinese leadership knows that they can pick up the phone to Berlin and Paris and perhaps make progress on separate areas. And also, there's an unwillingness to accept perhaps that parts of Europe have come to their own conclusions on China. And there is this sense that, you see this in the Chinese state media all the time. You see it in statements from the foreign ministry and the officials, the spokespeople, that Europe is a puppet of America. So I think that is maybe changing ever so slightly since the war began last year. I think that this is an issue on which the Europeans have been very resolute. They don't allow, it's the top of every agenda. The message is always very clear about do not sort of send military support to Russia. It's the relationship has certainly soured since then. So I wonder since then whether the Chinese are starting to think, okay, we're losing Europe, so to speak. So this is certainly a concern given the sort of the geopolitical dark clouds. But yeah, I guess whether or not they take Europe seriously or not, I suppose it's difficult for them to get beyond the sense that America is behind all of these actions, and that so I guess possibly not.
Thank you, Finbarr. Mareike, one of your areas of expertise is actually Chinese information manipulation and disinformation, depending on the definition. And I think it's quite important to talk about it here in Poland and in Central and Eastern Europe, because I do have a feeling that there is a tendency here to look only at Russia, and for quite, good reasons. Russia is much better understood as an actor actively shaping or trying to kind of, frame the debate for its own interests. But I think that for so many years, China has been associated only with this quote unquote pragmatic debate. So how do you see the role of China in shaping the European debate? Should we talk about disinformation from Beijing, or is it actually something else? And how seriously should we take it?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I do think it's really important to address this because, as you said, the Russian model to disinformation and information manipulation has really shaped how Europe looks at information spaces and what is done there. And I mean, the classic thing to say would be that, oh, Russia wants to destroy and China wants to build up positive narratives. And I think it's actually a little more complicated than that. And what I want to do here is explain a little bit the Chinese official approach to disinformation. Now, I will preface this by saying that there has been a lot of experimentation in recent years with so-called Russian-style disinformation by China as well, which is like, you know, we're going to throw out various competing conspiracy theories, basically throw mud at the wall, see what sticks. So China has started to experiment with that, but as of now, it's a little unclear how much of this is going to be the mainstay of the strategy in Europe. But it is important to understand that, yes, China has also started doing this. But what I think is really important for us to understand to how China approaches information spaces is what I like to call the United Front approach or United Front model to information spaces. And that is basically the desire to create a chorus of positive affirmative voices. So the PRC, the People's Republic of China, will approach any kind of group, anybody, any medium to try to create this chorus of positive voices of people reaffirming official talking points, of praising PRC policy, of praising what China is doing in order to kind of create this positive echo chamber. And for that is not only limited to the information space, but that involves approaching a lot of people and asking them to put out statements in support of the PRC. And oftentimes people will get letters and will get explicit requests to say certain things. So this is one mainstay of information manipulation from the PRC. And I think the other one that may even be more important for us to understand is the negative side of this, trying to prevent certain topics from being raised, from being discussed, or from being discussed in any way that does not fall in line with the official narratives pushed out by the People's Republic of China. This is kind of the coercive side of things. So this can include anything from putting pressure on journalists, from restricting visas to researchers, to journalists, to anybody else, to harassing people who are considered critics of the PRC. A lot of stuff has been covered under the topic of transnational repression, where the PRC actively goes after critics of itself. Over here, I think the most recent tactic that officials have employed is basically sending bomb threats on behalf of critics. So if a person travels somewhere, somebody will send a bomb threat to, I don't know, the hotel where they're staying. And then, of course, the person traveling there then has to explain that they didn't actually send this, and that, no, the police should not arrest them. And that this is, so basically these various harassment tactics in order to shut people up. And the idea is not that things are going to change overnight and that we're all going to start praising the PRC and the CCP and its policies. But the idea is to gradually chip away at where the debate is at, and to make sure that there is much more space for the positive voices. And ultimately, in the end, and I do think this is the goal, zero space for negative voices. We're far away from that. I don't think in Europe we're anywhere where we're not going to see any criticism, but there's a lot of drive behind shutting down critical debates. And people can use coercion, can use money and access as a tool, and then where that fails, very active, very prolonged, sustained harassment of individuals. And this United Front approach to information manipulation. It's not perfect, but as a package, it works quite well. And I think it's important that we see it and understand it as a package. And that really is the main point that I want to make here, to look at it in these terms as the Chinese party state looks at it.
So going back to the topic of the war in Ukraine, I do have a question to you, Justyna, which I think is, in the end, it's crucial when it comes to our assessment. And by our, I mean Poland, but also other countries on NATO's eastern flank. How do you see the current shape of China-Russia relations? We still, on the one hand, there's the whole narrative of China trying to remain neutral in the face of the Russian aggression of Ukraine. But also there are many people who believe that there is still some room to maybe influence China to distance itself from Russia, and they tend to look for some confirmation of this kind of ideas in the public space. But how do you see that? Do you think that this is a realistic approach, or what is the core of China-Russia relations?
So when we look at China-Russia relations, especially since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I would say that we see a pretty constant alignment between those two countries, and I do not see any specific changes in those two countries' relations. Of course, there's some kind of discussion that this kind of China-Russia friendship is not like 100% full friendship, that there is some kind of differences. There are, but there's some kind of strategic goal of China-Russia cooperation is the most important, which is anti-US, anti-Western approach, and also the most important, the survival of the regime in those two countries. And to be honest, what we are observing in the last few weeks and even months, it is a kind of a game that China plays with us, that Russia plays is with us, and China and Russia play with them with each other. So it was said that there's some kind of a discussion that in the last few months we can see a kind of a process of distancing. That China is distancing from Russia, and there are some examples of it. Let's say the summit of Shanghai Cooperation Organization in September last year, and I think it is a very good example of this game that China and Russia play with us, because it was after this summit, Russia published a readout in which Chinese side admitted that China has a little bit different perception of what is going on in Ukraine than Russia has. So, it was a kind of a game that China and Russia play with us to show that China is a little bit different, that China's perception is different. Then, what China did, and many experts, also decision makers, are pretty happy with that. China started to talk that it's against the using nuclear weapons. It was after Chancellor Scholz's visit to China in November last year, and it was a kind of a narrative that, okay, China said openly that is against the using nuclear weapons by Russia. But if you read exactly what Xi Jinping has said, or other Chinese officials, there's no any Russia word. So, okay, China is against the using nuclear weapons, full stop. But if you read exactly, or between the lines, between the characters, we can see that there is a kind of hints that the West is preparing for using nuclear weapons. So we should not take it as a, let's say, condemnation of Russia's threatening of using nuclear weapons. And in the last months that China published the so-called, the so-called peace plan, or 12 points that Xi Jinping talked to Zelensky, and that China appointed this special envoy for Central Asia, which is responsible for Ukraine, Li Hui, who came to Europe, to Ukraine, to Poland, to France, to Germany, and to Brussels. I think it's a kind of a game that China is playing. It's like a PR campaign to show us that China is to some extent distancing from Russia, and China is would like to be a peace broker. How? Come on, how? How could be a peace broker mediator? The China is doing something which is different from Russia. And to be honest, I have an impression that in the western part of Europe, China is pretty successful. I was told by one Chinese expert two or 3 weeks ago that he feels that the Western Europe is less critical on China comparing to the first weeks and months after the invasion. So we see this kind of a PR action, PR campaign that China would like to show that is distancing from Russia, but I do not see any specific when it comes to the substance, to the content of the policy in a specific the distancing process between Russia and China. So I call it, from my own thinking, that it's a kind of a maskirovka. So to mask some kind of real intentions, the real cooperation with Russia. And you can also see the last sentence, that you can see how dynamic and intensive is political dialogue between China and Russia. And compare it, for example, when it comes to political dialogue with China and Ukraine. Okay, Xi Jinping talked to Zelensky finally once during this 1.5 years. Li Hui went to Ukraine. Wow. But when you look at them, dozens of meetings between Chinese and Russian officials. And all the time talking about will to enhance economic cooperation, political cooperation, and so on and so forth. So I think I do not see. It's only kind of a PR campaign and a maskirovka game.
We have a few minutes left before the Q&A session, so I'll throw a surprise question at you. A very simple one, but also a very difficult one at the same time. Are you more on the positive side or on the negative side when it comes to the future of, the strategic rethink? I think that in our discussion, we've already kind of there is a conclusion that there are deep changes happening in Europe. But I think that the end game, there is no horizon when it comes to the end game of this debate. There is growing consciousness, but I think that still we have so many other problems on the table that China is seen as still somehow detached and not central to our problems. While in fact, for me, I do see that, most of the, maybe not most, but the majority, quite a few problems that we have, do have this China component in them, both economically, politically, security-wise. So do you think that we will be able to overcome this kind of strategic dilemma? Or, basically, are you on the positive side or on the negative side of it? Like, each of you, if you could, 1 minute.
I'm positive about what they're trying to do. I think that the economic security strategy, and I agree that the German-China strategy is very real. I worry about the bandwidth in Europe for dealing with China. I have to report on all of these summits in Brussels and beyond, Foreign Affairs Council, European Council. Honestly, China is always the first thing to be sacrificed from the agenda because it's a difficult topic to get any agreement on. Nobody really wants to have the discussion because they know that they're at loggerheads with each other, and it seems to just be the first one to go every time. So I wonder, how do you actually change things if people aren't willing to sit down and seriously talk about it? Look what happened at the G20 last week in India. Charles Michel and the president of the European Council and the Commission president, Ursula von der Leyen, had separate meetings with Li Qiang, the Chinese premier. They're not willing to meet him together. Not just him, but any other global leader that they met, apart from Modi. I think that sort of feeds into this sense that Europe is unable to speak to China in one voice. So on one hand, you have the difficulty in actually getting a proper, good, honest-to-goodness discussion among European leaders about China. How are you supposed to move things forward if it keeps falling off the agenda? And secondly, this idea that that the German Chancellor and the Foreign Minister are on different pages, that the European Commission and the European Council won't sit in on the same meeting with Chinese officials. That to me is the Chinese are looking at that and thinking this is weak. Europe is unable to sort of move things forward. So positive about the agenda, negative about the ability to fulfill the agenda.
60 seconds counting down, I guess. I am a short to mid-term pessimist and a long-term optimist. I call that my revolutionary optimism. It's like the dreamy stare into the distant future. I like to be optimistic about that. But so here's what I'll say. I think we need to recognize that by European standards, we've been moving at a very, very fast pace. We have gotten a lot of things done that usually you would not think possible without an immediate crisis. So I am quite astonished by the speed with which we have achieved things. I will say that it doesn't really matter how fast you run. If you're running late, you miss your flight, you missed your flight. So my question is it going to be fast enough for what is yet to come? Now, why am I slight? I do think that in the end, we are probably going to get our act together, but I'm not sure if we will get it together before we will be forced by some action that China takes to get it together. I do think, and you can, whether you want to call that pessimistic or optimistic, sooner or later with the trajectory that China is currently on, we're going to be confronted with this, and it's going to hit us probably in the face. We're going to be better prepared than we are now. I don't know that we're going to be fully prepared, but that whatever is going to hit us is going to force us to make those last adjustments. And I do think that in the end, we're going to get our act together. It's just going to be difficult, and it's going to require more things to happen.
A very difficult question, Alicja. But I think that we're on a positive side, and of course I know that there's so many obstacles, so many problems, but the fact that, as Mareike said, about that where we are now, just a few years in the EU, it is a really very new development. The very important issue is that there's a rising awareness of China, and also thanks to Putin, to be honest. So we should, well, it's because of him mostly, and we are aware. And what is also very important that we, and this topic was absent during this our conversation, is in the last few months, I think it is very visible the rising convergence in transatlantic relations when it comes to China. And of course, I think that till the elections in the US, well, we are pretty safe. So the question is what may happen in the US. But it is also very important. We can talk about strategic autonomy and so on and so forth, but it is very important that we must cooperate with the US when it comes to coping with China. And for now, I'm positive, but optimistic. So the question is what happens in 2024 in the United States.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions to our speakers? There are. Please. One. Do we have a mic?
Yes. Well, I am a little bit astonished with the referring to the Chinese policy as maskirovka, because in my humble opinion, China is playing its natural role, so to speak, because it's economically far more powerful than it's militarily. Because the Chinese military is, well, rotten and corrupt, and it's not functioning well. They are, in the last decade, they started to make jet engines properly. That's something that it's not very often mentioned, but it's true. So they are depending militarily, to some extent, on Russians sometimes. So it's, in my opinion, it's a natural role for China to, just be scared of using atomic weapons by anyone, because they have a smaller amount of them than the French, not to mention the US, right? So, yeah, that's my question.
So if I may, just to refer to your question, I do agree that China is afraid of using nuclear weapons by other countries. It's absolutely true, and I agree with you. My point was that China prepared a trap for us, saying during Scholz's visit and then after, and saying about these nuclear weapons later on, because we understood this kind of remark from Xi Jinping that is a kind of a condemnation of Russia, that Russia is threatening us to use the nuclear weapons. So it was kind of a political signal that we understood that, okay, Xi Jinping is criticizing Russia, which is not true, because when you read exactly what China is talking about nuclear weapons, I remember even the article in the Zhenmin Zhipao People's Daily Party's press organ, that it was a translation from the Russians, some kind of, that it was, if you read it, you can see that it was a kind of a message that not only Russia is threatening using nuclear weapons, but also the Western countries. Because who is responsible for the war? NATO, of course. So, you know, this is what I wanted to say, that it was not direct, open criticism from China of when it comes to Russia's nuclear threats. When it comes to the China's military, I'm not an expert on China's military, and what's the condition of the PLA, but China could deliver some military equipment to Russia that could be useful on the battlefield. You know, some kind of, I'm not an expert, but even this dual-use devices could be very, let's say, could help Russia, especially in these conditions on the battlefield. So this is also, I'm not an expert. I could not say how PLA is strong, if it could really help, or to what extent the, PLA depends on Russia. But for sure, China could be very useful delivering something military related to Russia.
Yeah, just briefly to support this, I think the statement, also because it was done after Scholz, they knew exactly what the German side wanted to hear, and how how nervous Germany is about anything nuclear weapons, etc. So I do think they played the German side like a fiddle on that one. And I would add on the PLA, yes, I agree that where the PLA is coming from is not good, and that yes, in terms of nuclear arsenal, they are way behind the US, Russia, and a ton of other countries. But there has been a lot happening in the PLA in terms of PLA modernization. And I mean, they are building up their nuclear stockpile as well. So I would caution not to completely underestimate what the PLA is capable of doing, because a lot of things have changed. We won't know until we see them in an actual fight, but things are not like they were 20, 30 years ago. So just to add that as well.
Tomasz Kamiński, University of Łódź. I have a question about non-state actors, which are very much engaged in various contacts with China. To what extent this strategic turn, talking about this strategic turn, they are ready for this, right? Big companies like Volkswagen or Mercedes, China is the most important market for them. For technological companies, China is a very important partner. For our cities, China is, the source of tourists. For universities, a source of students, and so on. To what extent governments thinking about strategic turn are under control and can impose this strategic turn on non-state actors?
I think that's maybe a good question for me. I think the key part that governments can play here is to signal to some of the bigger actors that we can't force you to do anything. We don't have certain policies. We can't force you, but the risks that you are taking, you are going to be on your own. And whether or not governments succeed in communicating this and actually communicating it credibly will determine a lot of how this is dealt with. I feel like in terms of tourism and universities, the pandemic has already done a lot to disabuse people over here that they can rely on Chinese money forever. So I think that has already led to some adjustments in the strategy. I think for instance, for the big German companies, that's not going to be the case. They have tied their future to China, and if they need to leave there, they're going to lose a huge chunk of their revenue. So really it is about, de-risking for them is essentially about, to use that term and to demonstrate why it means different things, is coming up with separate supply chains for themselves, which is actually also why right now probably you see additional investment of German companies in China. They're separating their supply chains. They're building their own Chinese supply chains, so should something happen, they can separate off their Chinese business, right? This is what de-risking means to the big German companies. But what de-risking must mean, for instance, to the German government, and by extension to the European government, is making sure that the risk that these companies are taking does not become a collective risk. You have your private profits, then make the risk private as well. And that is going to require some very strong signaling and some policy changes that I don't yet see how we're going to pull it off, but we do see some rhetoric going in the right direction and some governments signaling that yes, you can do this, but you're going to have a problem when this comes to a conflict. So we just need to make sure that we do even better on this point.
Yeah, just briefly, I mean, this week I was writing a lot about electric vehicles in Europe. The European Commission did this ex officio investigation that they've launched it into the subsidies of the Chinese sector. So European car makers think that the Chinese models are 20% cheaper in Europe than their counterparts from the EU. And immediately the German car industry came out with a critical statement on this. And, I spoke to some of the European Union officials on background, and there's a sense that they need to save this German car industry from itself because they're living from quarterly earnings call to quarterly earnings call. There's not the CEO may not be there in 2 years, and what do they care about the state of the industry or the state of European supply chains? So I do think that that's a hurdle that's going to have to be overcome. The statement from the broader European car industry was much more supportive than the German one. So yeah, I mean that's a battle that's going to be fought again and again, I guess.
I'm afraid we've run out of time, but I guess we could be continuing for a long time, but unfortunately we do have time constraints. So thank you very much. Yeah.
It's not always easy to recognize. It may look like this, or like this. It may be a burden, but it is a responsibility that we embrace nonetheless. But if it means this for one person and this for someone else, maybe it ultimately means being there for one another. It isn't handed to us, but we know where to find it. And how it feels, how it tastes, and what it sounds like when we finally have it. It means different things to different people, but for many, it means everything. And if we all fight for it, it will eventually bring us together.
Ihre Ausreise.
Jestem z zawodu lekarzem, zajmowałam się diagnostyką chorób nowotworowych.
W Białorusi zajmowałam się mikrobiologią i molekularną biologią.
Byłem nauczycielem szkoły podstawowej.
Naszym celem jest budowanie umiejętności, które są ważne na polskim rynku pracy.
Szybko nabierają takiej pewności siebie, bardzo szybko się uczą.
Wszystko możliwe, kiedy starasz się.
Każdy wybór ma swoje konsekwencje. Dziś na kazaniu o takich jak ty mówili, że to morderczynie.
A wiesz, że ta, która ci pomogła, trafi za kraty?
Trzeba mieć sumienie.
Jak mogłaś to zrobić własnej matce?
Aborcja to najgorsza zbrodnia.
Gdybym ja podjęła taką decyzję, nie byłoby cię tutaj.
Organy państwa nie będą przyglądać się temu obojętnie.
Życie i zdrowie kobiety jest najważniejsze.
Stop kryminalizacji aborcji.
Kobieta decyduje.
Dzień dobry. To znaczy, myśmy się dzisiaj widzieli. Wie pan co? Ja zmieniłem zdanie i chciałbym poprawić. Karty. W urnie. Dobrze? To ja sobie poszukam.
Serio? Pan sobie poszuka? Nadchodzące wybory są zbyt ważne, by zostawić je bez kontroli. Dołącz do obywatelskiej kontroli wyborów. Zróbmy wybory bez piecu.